Can I welcome all attendees here today, and in particular those who've travelled from outside Victoria. It's great to have you here, bringing some life and some economic activity to our CBD, especially given that large swathes of our state public service are apparently permanently working from home now. Now, former Prime Minister John Howard once famously pronounced Victoria to be the Massachusetts of Australia, referencing our seemingly persistent left-wing political views. Now, far be it from me to disagree with the great John Winston Howard, but I do believe he's wrong. We're not Massachusetts, we're more Pyongyang. How else could you explain our COVID experience of world record lockdowns, curfews, the closure of schools and even the shuttering of playgrounds? Well, our dear leader, Dan Jong-un, has departed this political life and is about to get his glorious statue, which I'm reliably informed Melbourne's pigeons are particularly excited about. Can I say I'm particularly delighted to have been invited to address this conference because the cause of industrial relations reform is one in which I have long been invested. It was as a university student that I shocked many of my elders by taking a radical and rebellious stance, as young people are often wont to do at uni. And the elders I shocked were my industrial relations lecturers in the Melbourne Law School. And the radical and rebellious stance I took was joining the H.R. Nicholls Society. So for these academics, an industrial relations system run by and for the benefit of big government, big unions and big business had replaced the Father, the Son and the Holy Ghost as their personal trinity. To these academics, the idea of allowing more freedom at work, including the freedom for individual workers and managers to negotiate terms and conditions, was anathema. To them, the idea of freedom of association, enshrining the right to join or in particular to not join a union, was dangerously radical. So far easier to demonise those challenging the failed political and industrial orthodoxy of the day as the new right or as some dark anti-democratic force. It was far easier to slur than to defend the failures of their own system or to dispute the clear benefits of IR reform focused on individuals and enterprises. I started my legal career as a workplace relations lawyer with a firm now known as Norton Rhodes. I've worked as a senior legal advisor to then Federal Treasurer Peter Costello, and while a barrister at the Victorian Bar, my practice included briefs in employment law. So I speak to you today with a long-held passion for industrial relations reform that delivers freedom, productivity and benefits for workers and business owners alike. But it is as a member of the Parliament of Victoria and as Shadow Attorney-General that I want to set out the need to change the way we do business in this state. Since the Keynote government referred Victoria's industrial relations powers to the federal sphere in 1996, this state has operated under a unitary system, where the Australian Parliament makes the industrial relations laws that apply to all Victorian employees, whether they be public sector or private sector. This referral of powers obviated the need for Victoria to continue its own Employee Relations Commission, a saving of considerable resources for a cash-strapped state. Well, nothing much has changed there. But it was also done with a broader ambition. The idea behind the referral of powers was to make Victoria a simpler and easier place in which to do business. A very worthy ambition. But how has that worked out in practice? If one examines the current state of industrial relations in this state, you have to say that it hasn't. Let me consider a number of measures to test that proposition. On the measure of working days lost through industrial action, in 2023, Victoria ranked number 1 in the nation with 31,500 days lost. Queensland and New South Wales were relative minnows at 24,000 and 21,000 days lost, respectively. How can it be that a state operating under a unified industrial relations system, which should in theory be simpler than dual-track systems and so less prone to strikes, should experience so many more days lost to industrial action? On the measure of WorkCover costs, Victoria used to have the lowest premiums in the country a decade ago under the former Liberal government. We also had the lowest number of days lost to injury per capita. Moreover, we had a statutory workers' compensation scheme that returned a dividend to the state government in the order of hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Not a bad trifecta, that. Lowest fees, safest workplaces and returns to shareholders. After 10 years of Labor, Victoria's WorkCover scheme is now in crisis. A description of the government itself. Constant tinkering by the Labor government and the appointment of a succession of Labor mates to its board and senior management ranks has led to a massive blowout in claims and a commensurate blowout in premiums, making the scheme unsustainable. Eligibility for mental health claims has been massively expanded under Labor and has been particularly draining for WorkCover. The ABC, yes, the ABC reported in March last year, quote, public sector workers make up 34% of mental health injury claims to WorkCover, despite the public sector making up just 10% of the state's labour force. In 2023, Victorian businesses suffered a 42% increase in WorkCover premiums, which in the words of the Victorian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, makes our scheme the most expensive in the country and is yet another increase to the cost of doing business in Victoria. Victoria's 1.8% premium compares unfavourably to the average equivalent premium in New South Wales of 1.48, while the Queensland rate is at 1.23. And far from returning a dividend to Victorian taxpayers, as a well-run government business enterprise should do, and which WorkCover used to do, Victorian taxpayers have been required to prop up the scheme with financial bailouts of $1.3 billion across 2021 and 2022, with further bailouts yet to be brought to book. Now, what is $1.3 billion to Victorian taxpayers? It's just the cost of building a new Royal Children's Hospital. Or in measures the current government might better understand, the cost of cancelling contracts for 2 Commonwealth Games or 1 East-West Link. That brings me to the measure of construction costs in the great state of Victoria. A state where until recently John Setka ran the CFMEU, while his great mate, underworld-linked figure Mick Gatto, is still on hand to provide mediation services. As a barrister, I used to provide mediation services too, but I suspect they are quite different to the ones on Mr Gatto's menu. My mediation services usually included a cup of tea and a selection of bickies, not a punch in the face and threats by bikies. In relation to the Victorian Labor government's so-called big build suite of large-scale infrastructure projects, the number of massive cost blowouts demonstrates that not only are Victorian taxpayers suffering from these out-of-control construction costs in this state, but we're seeing flow-on effects to non-government projects as well. As Treasurer in the previous Liberal government, I have a pretty fair understanding of our approach to infrastructure procurement. We ran a tender having already spent the time and effort to properly scope the project, because contract variations lead to massive cost increases. We ran tenders with a fixed price for delivery, unlike the approach under Andrews and Allen, where their response to cost overruns is to shrug their shoulders and literally say, well, things cost what they cost. And importantly, we ran a tender ensuring that labour costs were the responsibility of the contractors and subcontractors hiring and managing, not the state. We did not allow the CFMEU to control Victorian government projects, unlike the current government, whose political, factional and financial interests align with giving a rogue and militant union everything it demands and more. The consequence of Labor's approach is clear, but just a few examples will suffice. North East Link was promised at $5 billion. The current cost is $26.2 billion and counting. Metro Tunnel was promised at $9 billion. Current cost is $14.8 billion and counting. Westgate Tunnel was promised at just $500 million. Current cost, $10.2 billion and counting. The cowardly failure of the Andrews and Allen Labor governments to protect the public interest in favour of bending the knee to the CFMEU has led to a financial burden that will remain on the backs of Victorian taxpayers for a generation at least. Former ACCC Chairman Rod Sims said of CFMEU influence across projects in Victoria, quote, if somebody said the behaviour of the union was pushing up costs by 30%, that would not surprise me. But it's not just taxpayers who pay the price for the inflation of construction costs on public projects in this state. There's a flow on to all forms of civil construction. Analysis by SMEC of construction costs in Victorian urban greenfield developments, housing estates, from the second quarter 2018 to first quarter 2023 show an increase of 46.8%. And when media reports a backpacker earning the equivalent of over $200,000 a year to hold a stop-slow sign on a big build project, it's not hard to understand how ridiculous labour costs flow onto all sectors of the economy, pushing up the cost of building, including in the residential housing sector, which just makes Victoria less competitive. So what are the benefits of a unitary IR system in Victoria? This comparative advantage that Victoria offered businesses looking to invest in our state since 1996 has been progressively given away by the current Victorian Labor government. I do note that the Bracks and Brumby governments at least recognised the benefits that this initiative offered Victorian businesses and workers and did not try to tinker with it, or at least not too much. Of course, both Bracks and Brumby were nominally creatures of the so-called Labor right. The contrast with today's Labor leadership couldn't be more stark. Daniel Andrews was not just a creature of the socialist left, he was its chief spear carrier, and as young apparatchik and assistant state secretary of the Victorian ALP before his election to Parliament. Jacinta Allen was 25 years old when she was first elected to Parliament, and with that extensive lifetime of real-world experience that she brought to Spring Street, our Premier is also a committed member of the socialist left. Our Treasurer for the past 10 years, Tim Pallas, recently sold what remains of his soul and defected from the right to join the socialist left. Although, to be fair to Tim, he has been happily implementing the left's policies of high taxes, high debt, high deficits and massive government intervention right across his tenure. So what does that mean for industrial relations in Victoria? It means that this Labor government cannot help themselves. Despite having had the President of Fair Work being a Labor appointee for the entirety of its existence, this Victorian Labor government cannot help but meddle. So-called wage theft laws. Well, Victorian Labor legislated and instituted a very expensive, very intrusive bureaucracy, only to walk away from them before the High Court could confirm that their laws were unconstitutional and no charges laid could ever be sustained. What an anticlimax. The creation of a new labour hire authority, imposing a new bureaucratic barrier to what we used to call freedom of contract. Just listen to what the authority's own website says. There are several steps involved in applying for a labour hire licence. Find out more about how to apply, the information you'll need to provide, and what happens once you've submitted your application. And just under the subheading of list of documents required, here's the sub-subheadings. Identity documents, informed consent, fit and proper person documents, non-Victorian labour hire licences, BAS and tax documents, business plan, WorkCover certificates, piecework agreements, host addresses and accommodation addresses. I could go on, but then I'd be over time in my remarks and you'd all be asking to be paid time and a half.
Stupid.
What is clear is that this current Labor government has done everything it can to interfere and intervene in the labour market, despite the referral of our powers to Canberra and despite having a Labor-friendly Fair Work Australia acting as the industrial referee. So what to do? First, we need to clean up criminal influence in Victorian unions and on Victorian building sites. Labor governments at both state and federal levels have been embarrassed by the excellent journalism of Nick McKenzie, exposing the extent of criminal conduct and outlaw motorcycle gang infiltration into the CFMEU. The appointment of an administrator to the CFMEU, while welcome, is not close to enough. Remember, the BLF was deregistered in the 1980s, only to be replaced by the CFMEU. That is why we've already announced that a Victorian Liberal government will legislate to prevent outlaw motorcycle gang members and others involved in organised crime from being employed on Victorian taxpayer-funded projects. Labor has rolled out the red carpet for bikies. We'll show them a red card instead. Next, we need to clean up procurement practices in the Victorian public sector. When the Labor government abolished Victoria's Code of Practice for the building of construction industry, that was the first thing it did when it won the election in 2014, they ripped up a code that demanded integrity of both unions and contractors. And we've seen the consequences. And that's why we've announced that a Victorian Liberal government will reinstate a Victorian Code of Practice for the building and construction industry. We will also establish Construction Enforcement Victoria to oversee and monitor compliance with our code. Put simply, compliance with the code is non-negotiable. If you want to bid on a Victorian government project, or if you want to work on one, you'll have to comply. The sanctions for contractors who fail to comply will be severe. Exclusion from bidding for Victorian government projects will be the starting point. And ladies and gentlemen, we know that this works because it worked under the last Liberal government. And this is why Labor was so keen to scrap it, and it's why we're so determined to bring it back. Victoria's been the home of militant protest for many years, often industrial protest, but also political protest, and sometimes both. Victoria Police Commander Mark Elliott said on average, an average of 21 protests a week had been staged in the Melbourne CBD over the past year. That's 3 a day. This has consequences for everyone. Victoria Police has had to redirect at least 10,000 shifts of police officers from other duties to cover these perpetual protests. With aggravated burglaries increasing by 43% in my electorate, I'm pretty sure the good people of Malvern would rather see our police in our community keeping them safe instead of being sent into town to babysit the latest episode of performative political posturing. I have great respect for the men and women of Victoria Police and of course respect the operational independence of their decisions. However, I do note a concerning view among some that the role of police is to keep the peace at all costs, even at the expense of upholding the law. Their proposition is this: if the mob becomes so large and so threatening, then breaking some laws will be tolerated by police if it avoids some worse criminal activity. This mindset is simply an invitation to the mob. The worse your behaviour, the more latitude you will receive. Worse, this view undermines the notion of equality before the law and the rule of law itself. It is a very dangerous path down which to tread. That's why a Victorian Liberal government will support police by swiftly moving to restore strong move-on powers. Moreover, we will stand up for the basic principle that everyone is equal before the law, and that lawbreakers in protests should be dealt with equally, whether they are industrial protests, Black Lives Matter protests, or even protests against COVID-era lockdowns. Ladies and gentlemen, that's just a sample of the firm action that a Victorian Liberal government will swiftly take if elected in November 2026. There is more to be done, but we will not waste a day. Victoria is currently in an industrial dark age, and as a Liberal PM once said nearly 50 years ago, we need to turn on the lights. Victoria desperately needs change. My coalition colleagues and I look forward to being the agents of that change. Thank you very much.